Okay, welcome everybody to the latest edition of the Scholar Gypsies. I'm delighted to have John Waters on here with me today, and we're trying a little experiment, and we're running this episode live. The reason for today's episode is basically to discuss the sudden and it seemed to me unplanned resignation announcement by Taoiseach Varadkar earlier today. And John, I just wanted to get your initial thoughts on what what you think is going on here. It all seemed a bit unplanned, is the word I like.
Well, I don't know about that, Jerry, to be honest. I mean, obviously it's early days and we're kind of reading the runes as best we can. Uh, but it struck me when you look back at now, there's different possible explanations for this, but when you look back at the way he conducted himself in America at the weekend, it's very interesting in different ways. Like, because the things he said were very forthright about Gaza and Israel. I mean, he said that America should not be giving arms to Israel, which is fair enough. And he made very, very reasonable remarks about the Palestinian plight, the plight of the Palestinians. I mean, I gather something like 30,000 people have died there since October the 7th. So that's a reasonable thing for a leader, and a leader of Ireland, the long tradition of Irish neutrality, would certainly have felt entitled to say those things. And then he said that he was speaking to Kamala Harris, the vice president, and he congratulated her on having actually called for a ceasefire and said that it was a very courageous thing to do. Now, they're pretty explicit things for any Taoiseach to say. You know, they're kind of in diplomatic languages, they're about in the red, like, you know what I mean? They're in the red. Now, the thing that strikes me about that, or struck me about that, is that's not like Varadkar. He's not a man given to courage. You know, like if you think about it, he reminds me of that scene in Yes Minister years ago, you know, where I can't remember the exact context, but Jim Hacker, the minister, was exposed. So coming up with some brilliant brainwave that he was going to do something very, straight on and take on and he said, I'm going to do it. And then Sir Humphreys, Minder, said to him, that's very courageous, Minister. Very courageous. He said, what do you mean courageous, you know? And that would be Radker's kind of response in the norm of it. Like, can you think of anything he said in the since 7 years that was actually leading in any way that was courageous? Now, that's one thing I say. Now, there's complexities to that. And this was baked into that cake in the very beginning, that Israeli Palestinian thing, because of all the stuff we know about the different allegiances in Ireland, the fact that, Ireland has certain elements within Ireland have very strong affinity with Palestinian people. And in general, I think the Irish people would be sympathetic to the Palestinian people anyway, in principle. Not that they're anti-Israeli as such, but they would kind of be looking at some of the behaviors of the Israelis and saying, come on, what's going on here? And then America being embroiled in that. But that seemed to me to be a kind of a potential flashpoint for the Irish government all the time, because they were kind of doing a little bit of saber rattling. If you compare it to, say, the Ukraine war, where they were 100% on, but you see, it's easy to hate the Russians. They're easy meat, for hate. And, they're really good at it. Like, the Irish government really led the charge there, but they're not going to do that against the Israelis. So it was kind of low key. And sometimes you thought there was a kind of a conflict between what the government's, as it were, international obligations were. That means like their obligations to their puppet masters, really, and what their kind of cultural and political imperatives were. And that there was always going to be that risk of a flashpoint. Now, that's one kind of spin on it. But you can see it in a different way, which is that this was the kind of a Harry Carey, that he did this, that it wasn't that he kind of like, okay, one aspect of it is that he was being brave and outspoken and to hell with the consequences. Well, I leave that up to people, given the history. The other was that he wanted out for other reasons and saw that this would be a glorious way to go out, making a principled statement at last, right? what an epitaph! The man who stood up for the Palestinians
Mm.
and went and fell on his sword straight away. That kind of thing. So there's that in it, I think. Now that leaves aside all the other stuff. There's a lot of debris around Varadkar uh, uh, at the moment, and it has been building now for a long time. I mean, really, like, this guy should never have been Taoiseach. Let's be absolutely frank from the start. Like, he's completely unsuited to the job. The last person in the country, actually, you would say, should be Taoiseach was Leo Varadkar, because he had zero love for Ireland, zero knowledge of Ireland, zero empathy with Irish history or the Irish cause in any way. And the shocking thing, I suppose, is the timing. Now, you got to say from the timing that it's, for example, linked into the referendum result of less than 2 weeks ago. I think so. I think that was a real kick for those guys, particularly for him. And I think he saw the writing on the wall. And one other thing I noticed in the last 24 hours or so, there was a report which I can't actually find now, but I remember seeing the headline, and it was about Michael McDowell's proposed new alliance. He's already supposed to have the support of 7 rural independent TDs, whoever they might be, and that it's kind of going to be an open kind of alliance, no particular, I don't think, party whip or whatever. It's actually a little bit like, by the sound of it, like AJ Cahill's The Irish People, another one of those, which is, I think, a good thing. But the interesting thing was that yesterday I saw a report in which Varadkar was welcoming this and celebrating, the more the merrier kind of thing, and it's great to see, parties, new movement starting in Irish politics. Now, he doesn't believe that. Like, these guys have been closing down political movements for the last, how many years? Like, they've had Antifa on the streets, battering people off them. Anybody who dare to question the government or attempt to run an election against them or anything like that, they've been battered off the street by Antifa thugs who are paid by the government. Now, let's be clear. That's what's been happening. So he's not celebrating the advent of a new political movement at all. That's the last thing he's doing. Maybe he's kissing Michael McDowell's ass to a degree because he's scared of him, and I think justifiably scared of him. Because I mean, there is a serious, if you add all up the various pieces, Gerry, the vote on the 70-odd% vote against the government. The fact that, a third of the TDs, the Fine Gael TDs, have already jumped ship. The fact that Varadkar himself has taken, I think, was it the 8th count the last time or something like that?
Yeah.
To get elected in his own constituency. He's not looking forward to the next general election and never would be. And he has. I have as good a chance of getting elected in that constituency, if you ask me, as he has. And I don't even know where it is. So I have this sense that he has created this kind of heroic moment for himself, where he'll go down. He thinks he won't. He thinks he'll go down as the man who stood up for Palestine and fell on his sword, and he will be up there with Michael Collins and Pierce and all these other guys who sacrificed themselves for the greater good of the world and decency and peace and so on and so forth. I don't buy it, and I don't think anybody else buys it.
Well, that might be the narrative he tries to sell. There's a number of things you brought up there, and I think one of them we'd have to look at is if we look at progressive Ireland as we've now come to see it over the last 5 or 6 years, or the progressivism that has run throughout all the major political parties, what you might say is that the one area of disagreement that the major political parties have with not necessarily Biden or Kamala Harris, but the actual administrative state, the uniparty, the military industrial complex, they're full on supportive of Israel. And we have a country that on that particular issue, we're on the wrong side. And I don't mean we, I mean, we'll say the people we've been waiting to wake up for the last 4 years, they're for some reason, and I haven't spent much time looking at the Gaza conflict myself or getting dragged into it, but for some reason, they're activated on that subject here.
Yeah,
And
yeah. It seems to be something. I think it emanates really from the recent history of Sinn Féin more than anything else. I mean, that's one of the strong buttressing elements of that. Because there was that sense of, Palestinian as being in a certain sense analogous to the Irish experience as it used to be understood by Sinn Féin. Of course, now Sinn Féin is a globalist party. This makes zero sense at all. Like, why they should have empathy with another country when they don't have any for their own. It's a really good question. But and that kind of has been the mainstay of that, I think, sentiment, and. So, but it was always going to cause problems for the government in this situation, that sentiment was out there, and particularly that it was attached to Sinn Féin, because they were seen and are seen as the major threat to the main parties, rightly or wrongly. I hope not wrongly, and I actually think wrongly. Actually, I think that Sinn Féin is in disarray and is in collapse, really, in the overall, in the sense of having the capacity to form a government, even as a significant partner within it. Unless they get Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael to go in with them, which of course, come on, I wouldn't put any money on that either, against it, So that was and you could see the various comments from senior politicians that they weren't happy with having to support Israel, or having to seem to support Israel, or having to kind of, walk that tightrope of, our close bond with America, who were supporting Israel in a very open way, and we were less kind of enthusiastic, to say the least, and that was going to be a problem. So there was a certain opportunism in it now, because I mean, it is quite clear to people now that whatever happened on October the 7th, and that's all very muddled. That the Israelis are not nice people in a military sense. They're not nice people. Like they're not nice.
no, but
And
John, I just want to just ask you a question there, because over the last year we've met the Israeli government, regardless of whether, the way I look at this is, regardless of what side I might be on that conflict, or what nuances there might be, I would have said in previous generations our diplomatic class would have been good at keeping us out of controversial interactions with a government
oh
like
yeah,
Israel. Now, over the last year, I can think of at least two, if not three, situations where the Israeli government have come out directly against Ireland, and that, in a sense, their knives would have been out for Ireland. I'm just giving it, and there'd be plenty of support in the US, in the US administrative state allied to Israel, and that
yeah.
if Varadkar had to fall on a sword, Varadkar had to fall on a sword, kind of thing.
Well,
That could
that's
be
one possibility within that whole schema of things. I don't think I don't but you see, if you go back in our history, like say the middle part of the last century, like from like the 60s on, for sure, people like Frank Aiken and these guys, the foreign policy that they were adopting was that of a small, powerless nation who had a policy of neutrality, which was somewhat misunderstood, because it didn't mean that we opted out of taking a position. What it meant was that we didn't sign up to any side in advance. We were quite open and able to speak about the moral issues involved in any conflict, and we did. And in fact, Ireland was one of the main drivers of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, that really was quite a significant part of preventing things going off the rails in the Cold War situation, or at least that's what it seemed like at the time. Now everything is in such disarray, and everything is kind of so much up for grabs that we're not even sure, about any of that history. But on the face of things, that was the situation. And these guys, without authority, without consultation with the people, without any democratic mandate whatsoever, and in fact, beyond that, they had no democratic mandate at all. this government. Like they had zero. I'll come back to that in a moment. But in the narrow context, they didn't ever go to the people and say, we're thinking about actually dissolving our neutrality and starting to support NATO and the United States and all these things. Now they've been supporting the United States for a while, and I mean they've been suckered into that because we always kind of thought of ourselves as part of the West, and the United States was the big brother and protector of the West and so on. And that seemed the right thing to do. And I mean, I was as guilty of that as anybody else in the past, of making that mistake. I mean, I now realize what a serious mistake that is to have made. And, the government, at a time when the government is actually doubling down and digging itself deeper in. And that's really, I think, very serious. And that's down to Varadkar and Martin in particular. Who are men of no qualities, really. Like they really are. Like they have no principles whatsoever. It's all horse trading and clinging on to power or whatever it is. It's not even power. It's contingent office. It's office they're holding on to. And Indy Kenny was even worse. Like all he wanted was the car. And be able to wave out at everybody. Whoa,
But you're also talking about two men with no life or work experience outside of the political arena.
Yeah. I mean, Varadkar in particular, Martin is a different story because, and I don't, he's not no better particularly, and that's the history. The recent history has shown that. But on paper, you would have said Martin was a better bet than Varadkar. But Varadkar, was a non-entity. He didn't really do anything. He didn't really say anything. He never expounded any vision of Ireland. How did he come to be Taoiseach? It's crazy.
He seemed to be the first. I remember he was for a short period Minister for Health, and he seemed to be the first social media politician who, I suppose, if you wanted to, a flare signal that went off in my head pre the COVID era was he seemed the first minister that would appear on political and current affairs programs, commenting on the problems while he was the minister. Supposedly,
and that's right. And he had this reputation for being honest. Remember that? He was supposed to be the most direct and outspoken of all politicians. Which is nonsense, obviously. But that's what journalists kept saying about things. It's like they used to always say that Brian Cowan was the most intelligent politician that ever lived. Until it turned out not to be true. But they kept saying it. And so it's like that thing about, that if you get a reputation for getting up early in the morning, you can stay in bed all day, and you can be, if you get a reputation for being highly intelligent, you can do anything and nobody notices, But Varadkar was really an empty space, as far as I could see now in retrospect. Now, I have to say I didn't see that at the time because he had this kind of quiet air of authority, He was, quite tall and impressive, and he was kind of a little bit, it wasn't as slim as he turned out to be when he went through the gay phase, but he was kind of, he used to wear these kind of ill-fitting suits, and but he looked like somebody who was, a serious player, and maybe was part of some kind of new wave of conservatism in Ireland, because he did present himself as this idea as a conservative, like he was supposed to be a pro-life doctor, he just binned that in the first the first call, and similarly with his view on gay marriage. I mean, in 2010 he was talking about the importance of marriage, and that marriage was a man and a woman, and that was his view, and children must have their parents and a father and a mother and all this stuff. 3 years later he was basically excoriating people for saying the same things, and I noticed that in personal relations, but I didn't know him very well or at all. I met him, I used to run into him here and there, as you would on the circuit, in different functions and events and so on, and he was always kind of friendly and in kind of nothing burger kind of way, and he always had so he was always this kind of standoffish kind of thing. He was always kind of like looking thoughtful, it's like that scene a while long ago in Glenroe where Pat Barry and Miley were talking one day, and Miley was this kind of dopey farmer, and Pat Barry was the blade, and Miley says to Pat, Pat, he says, people think because I don't be saying anything that I'd be thinking deep thoughts, but a lot of the time I wouldn't be thinking anything at all.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that to him, all right.
Yeah.
Um,
And so that's kind
yeah,
of
what I do remember about his early career, and because I do like it does resonate with what you're saying there. He had a kind of a habit of kind of going on spontaneous solo runs. I remember once he did a kind of attack on Gareth Fitzgerald in the Dáil, a former Fine Gael
oh
Taoiseach
yeah.
and leader, and it was almost like it landed him into a load of trouble at the time, and it was almost like he walked into it without thinking. Do you know this
Well,
kind of way?
another aspect of that you might, yeah, another way you might put it was that he was, even within Fine Gael, a bit of a cuckoo in the nest. He didn't understand Fine Gael's traditions either. He didn't respect their history in the same way as he didn't understand Ireland or respect its history. He was a complete interloper, not just in Ireland, but in his own party. And he was a solo runner. And his main ally was the media. He was a media politician. I mean, like the D4 and the Montrose set, they all loved Leo. Leo was the ledge.
And
You know,
they still do probably like to a
they do, yeah.
degree.
But it's only because even before he came out as gay, that he seemed to be like one of them. And he clearly, he was kind of hanging around Kenny in the Kenny, but clearly had no respect for Kenny. Yeah, that was kind of clear. And none of
And
them
the,
had, none of
and they
them had.
hadn't, if you remember, they didn't have the smarts to take out Kenny when they tried to. If you remember, they tried to
Yeah,
take him
yeah.
out,
They made
and
several bungled attempts. Yeah.
so and I'm like Phil Hook. I suppose that guard of Fine Gael has gone now, and I suppose what you might say in the broader picture for Fine Gael, and we were talking about it privately earlier, is that Leo Varadkar with this announcement is the 11th Fine Gael TD to announce that they will not be seeking re-election in
But
the
did
next
he
general
say that
election.
now? Has he said he won't be seeking re-election? Because
I, well,
I,
he said he's going to keep his seat. He said he was going to resign as leader of Fine Gael and of the obviously Taoiseach,
yeah, but
and he was going to remain. He was going to remain as a TD until the general election. But
okay.
I couldn't find that he's made. Now I could be wrong on
Yeah,
this. I haven't missed.
I can't imagine he's going around again. I mean, I think that's one of the
No.
main things that he doesn't. He knows he hasn't a chance, and the humiliation of that will be immense, given what he's seen in the last couple of weeks. Like that, there's a lot of knives out there for him, politically speaking, and not he hasn't got many allies in the ordinary people of Ireland at this stage. What I mean, the surprising thing is that he's lasted so long, and that it took them so long to see through him. But that's another story. I think that he is now. He knew. He saw the writing on the wall, and the chances are. I mean, you see, one of the problems is with the political system as it stands is where is the new energy going to come from? Um, and there's no energy within the system whatsoever. Like there's a tiny rump of marginal independents, people like Matty McGrath and Michael. Sorry, the guy from Limerick.
Michael Fitzmaurice and
Fitzmaurice,
McNamara and
yeah, and McNamara,
Fitzmaurice.
yeah, those guys. There's something there. Not always a huge amount, to be honest, but there's something there. And if they had some kind of something behind them, they might be great, but they haven't done very much in the last few years, and there was a lot to be done if there was anyone to do it.
Yeah.
But I think he's seen that, and I think that like Sinn Féin are hammered as well, like on the face of it, like the only the big danger is that what you'll get out of this election, leaving the independent thing aside for the moment, is some kind of default result, whereby a party, the way that Ireland used to win, like qualify for the World Cup, they'd be waiting for the result in some other match, it's that kind of syndrome, and that we end up saying, oh, all right, so they're the government because the other crowd were so reprehensible, and the other crowd were even more reprehensible, that this crowd who are so banal and nondescript that people started voting them. That's how the Green Party got back from having destroyed the country in 2008 to being back in government less than 10 years later. Or 12 years later, sorry. But to go back to that point, that moment, like people don't remember what happened in the election of 2020. Like Liv Varadkar, was re-elected as a TD in 2016. Enda Kenny was still Taoiseach. The following year, Enda Kenny stepped down and Varadkar stepped up. So he was operating Enda Kenny's, let's say, overall, majority. It wasn't a majority. It was a tight enough system. They had there was a kind of, what was that? There was a particular agreement they had. What's called Fine Gael agreed to support them in office.
That's right. Yeah.
Supply and something and supply. I don't even understand that term actually. Confidence and supply or some nonsense.
That was it. Yeah.
Yeah, and supply what? Heroin? I don't know.
But John, let me put this to you now, is that first I want to get your opinion as to how this affects when a general election might take place. But second, I kind of feel we might be going into that 81, was it the early 80s, where we had 3 elections in the space of 14 or 15 months, that there's going to be a fragmentation, regardless of what happens, that there's going to be a massive fragmentation in the next election anyway, because essentially you have a 30%.
I don't know, Gerry. I would actually take the opposite view, even though that there might be at a surface level an appearance of fragmentation. I think there's something much more interesting happening. I want to come back to the other thing, by the way, in a few minutes, because it's very important to point out that Varadkar never had a mandate of any kind.
No.
Sorry, but I wanted, because I wasn't finishing that.
You can go there first, John, if you want.
Yeah, well, come back. Remind me of this point again now, because this is very important. Like Varadkar, he then went into the 2020 election. He was hammered. Fine Gael were hammered, but he stayed on because there was no clear result. He stayed on as basically a caretaker Taoiseach from February 2020 until the end of June, while all this supposed negotiation. Now, anybody who looked at the outcome of the election knew there were 2 options: either another election straight away, or Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael go into a coalition together. And there was no other option. Now, of course, that would have been an undemocratic result on its face straight away, because they had both ruled it out in advance of the election. They said, no, under no circumstances, blah, blah. But now, as Desi O'Malley said, the national interest, it cropped up. And suddenly by June, 4 months in, at the end of a period, or at a juncture in our history, which followed the most extraordinary period in the public life of Ireland for a very long time, where the most draconian legislation ever conceived of in a free Ireland was introduced by our own government. People were locked in their homes. We don't need to go through it. People were terrorized, they were tyrannized. Guards were driving people home from the parks and so on, off the beaches, dragging people off both beaches. Let us never forget this, dragging, because they were taking their children to swim or to do a bit of fishing or whatever it was. This can never be forgotten. And Varadkar was presiding over that. And if you remember that infamous incident in Phoenix Park in May of 2020, when he was stripped to the waist with his gay mates, rubbing each other's tummies, while everybody else was told stay at home and you weren't allowed to have picnics, and they were out picnicking in the park. All of that. So that was, and then the thing was cobbled together, and Martin came in as Taoiseach. Again, no mandate. And continued the same policies. I mean, Varadkar set the mold, and Martin filled it. And then we went on to the next election, or we've gone on then for the last, and then Varadkar got his turn again, and blah blah, round and round it went. Now, so he has no mandate whatsoever, even remotely. I mean, even in his own constituency, he was like just literally snuck in on the just before the final whistle, But the thing about why I don't necessarily agree with your thesis there, Gerry, and I could be wrong, but I just have this feeling that something's shaping up now, and it's kind of a new approach to independent representation. It's like as if there's a kind of a subconscious recognition in the system. You see, one of the things that we've noticed, and this is something very interesting in the public domain, and I haven't quite figured it out yet or kind of nailed it down, but that vote last week or the week before last is clearly evidence of something that we didn't understand beforehand. Like nobody predicted that result. Nobody, including myself, nowhere near it.
No. I wasn't even. I wasn't even.
I thought there might be a marginal no on one of the issues, or maybe the two, with a bit of luck. But that was about as good as I expected it to come out. And what that tells me is that our understanding of what was going on in the psyche of Paddy was off the mark. So we thought he was kind of like, terrified, craven, acquiescent through all of this. And maybe he was for a while. Maybe he was for the first year. But then I think what actually happened was that was really quietening him down was the climate of mutism, which I've talked about many times, which was enforced by the LGBT goons and Antifa and all that, which is like that if you opened your mouth in public about anything, you're liable to be attacked and called names or racist or a xenophobe or a homophobe or a misogynist or a blah, 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 blah. And that way we discovered on that Friday was that there was only one last vestige of the Irish Republic remaining in the entire culture. And that was that little corner of the polling centre where you went in. It wasn't even a booth anymore in mine. It was just like a little high table. And you kind of had to kind of crouch over your paper, like, in case there was anybody watching or filming you, and make your mark. That was the freest place that we've had in this country for a hell of a long time, Jerry.
Yeah,
and that's where Paddy kicked the chair, as I often said he would, that he said, enough of this now, lads, enough of this already. And I think that there's a consciousness, something similar that within the political life of the country. Because remember, a lot of the political life is the parties, and they're really gone. Like they're corrupt to the core. Fianna Fáil is deeply corrupt now. It's finished unless it gets a completely new leader and a completely new philosophy and really goes out against the people as De Valera did in the first instance and start to explain what the hell it's all about. Similarly, Fine Gael, well, I mean, that's been true for a long time. Fine Gael is an establishment party. It's a money party. It's a fairly shady party. It doesn't even have a sense of humor, as Fianna Fáil does. I mean, that was Fianna Fáil's redeeming quality always was that it was better cracked than Fine Gael. You would, if you were actually invited to a party and it was go to a Fianna Fáil party before you go to a Fine Gael one, because it'd be dry, in Fine Gael. But then the Labour Party, appalling bunch, and all these other ones are all. But there is still around the fringes, there is some consciousness of the people and the purpose of politics still. And I think that's what that's trying to do now in some kind of, inchoate way, is to arrange itself so that it can go in there and actually do something. Because, in the last 30 years of Irish politics, 35 years, since 89, when really we started the coalition, that the Fianna Fáil lost its capacity to have overall majorities in 89. I think that was about the last one, or 87 really. But from then on, it became clear that it was always going to be coalitions. And of course, what happens in Irish coalitions is that the major party, whether it's Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, grab all the financial, economic ministries, then things like defence and foreign affairs, and then they leave the rest to the small party. And this was a fatal error because things like environment and so on sound, Fianna Fáil would go, but they're lethal in the hands of a leftist organisation. And what we found with the mass migration thing was that was bedded down by Labour and DL back in the mid-90s. And by the time Fianna Fáil and the PDs, Michael McDowell, came in then, and I think it was 97, it was too late to do anything about it. And McDowell couldn't fight it. Like he was literally tearing his hair out, what was left of it, because of what they were doing, and he wasn't able to stop it. And he knew that it was all a scam, and he knew it was a stunt, and that there was gangsters and people trafficking and all that. And he said it. He said it back 25 years ago, and so on. So now, I think there is this consciousness now that there's a kind of almost like self-motivating movement to try to seize that, that tail wagging the dog, that smaller party, that the independents need to get to be that tail.
Well, the thing, the thing that we might find, I suppose, when I said fragmentation is, I suppose, kind of what I'm talking about is if we take the Fine Gael party now, the way I'm looking at the the TDs that are leaving, you'd look at them and you'd say the moderates are getting off the ship, whatever
Yeah,
ones are left. That leaves them with a woke, like that leaves with the woke brigade, right? You've 80% of the parties chasing a 30% of the vote is the way I look at it. Like if you want to call it the woke vote, if you the
yeah.
progressive vote, and there's 70%, as we found out in the referendum, 70% of the population are open to proper conversations about LGBTQ, especially like the trans stuff, migration,
Don't forget the P.
and don't forget the a proper investigation into the COVID era, the vaccines, the passports, all of that stuff.
Mm.
But it's that mutism you were talking about that
Yeah,
it has, in a sense, saved this government or enforced them to start hallucinating about
yeah.
how much of the country is on their side when
That's
obviously it's
yeah.
not.
That's exactly right, Gerry. And you just think about it like that. The media, of course, is a critical element. The set-aside media, as I call them, they that mutism is beginning to break down, and the media is beginning to lose, its power. And but if you consider, like, you see, they have for several years got by on the slipstream of that corruption. They're purchasing all these so-called journalists and getting them to put out their word, and everybody, all the dupes out there, think this is the news because it's on the news. But whereas I was kind of in a certain backhanded way complimenting Varadkar on the statements he made in the United States, concerning, say, for example, the Palestinian people and the number of people who have been killed, and it's a terrible thing. But as I say, that figure is about 30,000. Well, on Varadkar's own watch, at least 20,000 Irish people have been killed unnecessarily and in a manner that has been grotesquely covered up by all the authorities involved, the medical authorities, the political authorities, the media authorities, the judicial authorities where they were involved. And he made no comment at all about that. He had nothing to say about the bloodshed, the grief, the horrors that have happened in Ireland in the last 4 years, which shows you that it's not that he doesn't know, it's that he knows that the media are not going to break the omerta, and that he can get away with it, and that he'll be down the road running in no time, and he thinks he's got away with it now.
So there's a certain element of avoiding the inevitable accountability that's coming, and he might be.
Yeah, because I've been talking a lot about this in the last couple of years, Gerry, where that there was this, and I didn't want to be blackpilling people, but it seemed to me that, on the face of things at least, that we had moved, in a certain sense, in Irish society and in lots of other societies, into a situation that was kind of post consequences for abuses of power. That because there was no watchdog and no sentry in the lookout post, they could get away with literally murder, and were getting away with literally murder. And that now that's another insignificance of that vote, see, because these guys go into everything. And remember, all these politicians are doing all kinds of polling and focus grouping all the time, so they kind of know what that means, and they know it's not a kind of profoundly kind of erudite.
It's not a Lisbon Treaty vote. Do you know what I mean?
No, it's not,
Or
and
where,
it's not a disagreement about wordings in the Constitution. It's a fuck off vote. That's
yeah.
what it is. And I think now they're beginning to understand that, and this has been the most momentous signal yet. you know, I gathered there were tears in the Dáil later on. I didn't see this. I don't watch this stuff if I can avoid it. But you know, certain female politicians were fairly distraught about the loss of Leo, and indeed he was a bit wobbly himself. I did watch that, uh, and but I thought it was brass necked more than anything else. You know, that he could actually go on pretending that he had been, you know, in some way had done a
Successful.
had done a decent job for
Yeah.
Ireland, when he had done the opposite. An absolutely obscene job is what he's done, and he needs to be told that. You know, I mean, I actually did a couple of streams over the last couple of weeks, and I was really letting rip about him, you know, in all kinds of ways. I can't remember all the things I said, but some of them were pretty, you know, out there.
Well,
But
like the one thing I would say, and sorry to interrupt you, but the one thing I'd say about you, John, because your output is huge, is that even what you wrote about McDowell over a couple of weeks, is that the political class can't help but to read that, in my opinion, because nobody else is writing anything about them. Do you know what I mean? Other
yes,
than press releases. So
yes,
so I would never, although the alternative media space in Ireland is small, I wouldn't underestimate at all how annoying it is to some of these people, because I know some of the characters you've gone into in detail, and McDowell would be one of them. And you given the pros and the cons, like on McDowell and his career, is that I definitely see that has, that would have given him confidence, whether that's what you meant or not meant.
yeah,
But
no, no. Well, I guess, you know, I understand what you're saying, Jerry. I mean, in all fairness to myself, I'm trying to be fair to them. I mean, I'm not running an agenda here other than that I want my country to be decently led, decently governed. I want an end to tyranny. I want an end to lies. I want an end to abuses that result in the destruction of our constitution. I wanted the end to supranational government of Ireland. I didn't vote for the World Economic Forum, and I don't want them in my life. And I think that we need to make it illegal for any Irish politician to be a member or to have any association with the World Economic Forum and all of these other bodies. So it's as simple as that. I mean, that isn't an awful, you know, that's not any kind of agenda other
it's not
than,
a big, yeah, it's not a big
yeah,
request.
like it's not much to ask for, but of course it's far right. You know, listen to these gobshites who go on about this stuff and the media. You know, I mean, it's just disgusting. Those guys, they're most disgusting. I can't imagine how we're ever going to get back our media sector other than by just waiting until they're all gone and starting over. But you know, I think that in that context that there is a possibility for McDowell now. See, McDowell is a very interesting figure, even though, you know, as I say, I have seen both sides of him, and I've described both sides of him. And, you know, I'm not in any way unfair to him, I don't think. You know, he was a cocky, obnoxious git when he was younger. And you know, he was, the PDs were, you know, at the time they were called a right-wing party, which is only half right, as it were. They were right wing, as it were, on economic issues, and as we used to say, left wing on social issues. That was kind of their position. You know, they were a D4 party. And that recent clip that's been going around with Desmond Fennell, that's what drove McDowell mad in that, was that Desmond was describing him, you know.
Yeah.
But having said all that, and we have a laugh about that, and I mean, that's the kind
Yeah,
of
no.
banter that he and I have been, without any consensus between us, going
Well,
on.
he made a point to mention you in that interview. So
Did he?
yeah,
Oh,
well,
yeah, he did. Yeah, he
yeah,
did. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's right. That's right. He did. And that's the kind of stuff that's been going on. But at the same time, I really place a lot of value on what he's been doing recently. And the first thing really was in relation to the hate speech laws. He caused a massive rumpus of that, and he caused the whole thing to be held up. Now I gather it's coming back in, and I'm really counting on him to hold that line. And to try and send it back to the Dáil or whatever the hell it takes to stop this happening. Because, you know, much as I'm prepared to kind of go to jail for these principles, I kind of prefer not to, you know. And I'm sure you're probably in the same boat as that. You know, because I don't know. You know, I have been in jail before, Jerry, as you well know. You know, I spent a long time in jail, at least like 45 minutes, actually. You know, and it's not pleasant. You know, so the idea a couple of 100 days, like poor Enoch Burke is having to do, for similar principles. Like, why these guys, they can talk about tyrannies in other countries, and here's one in their own land, and they don't see it. Anyway, that stuff. But so I do think that McDowell has something really good to offer, because he's highly respected, rightly. I'm not, for all that I might disagree with him about certain things. You got to say he's a man of extraordinary intellect and caliber and courage and conviction and authority. He's a authoritative figure, and that's what has been missing from the independent sector in the Dáil for a long time. That there's no galvanizing quantity that'll bring them together and try to organize them. And the other thing I would say about that, whereas in the past, in previous elections, after previous elections, the kind of raggle-taggle that used to be up on the back benches, by and large, was always lefty. This time, it won't be lefty. And it won't be righty either. It'll be mainstream, Main Street, Ireland. The highways and byways of Ireland being represented for the first time by people who know what they think and know what they want. And I think Michael McDowell is actually, ironically and amazingly in some respects, the man who can actually read that, because now he is actually probably the only conservative left standing in the entire political establishment. And I mean that in the best possible way. I mean, he's a conservative in the classical sense of wanting to maintain his country and maintain its value system and its institutions and its constitution and so on. And that's something immensely to be welcomed, no matter where we stood on him in 20 or 30 years ago, And so I'm quite optimistic about that. And I was buoyed up to hear that he had this new kind of informal alliance thing.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, I don't know exactly how it's going to work, because it's kind of got it as a recipe. There's a recipe in there somewhere for a lot of dissension and backbiting and so on, disagreement and so on.
Well, you see, I think they're useful vehicles. They could be useful vehicles, but inevitably, I would like to see a lot of independents run in the next general election and local elections, as many as possible. But that inevitably, even if they're loosely coordinated, will bring more friction points. And you could see a situation where, out of that, a new political out of that,
a new movement could forge itself within the system.
It could forge itself out of that, rather than expecting one to be ready in place for the next general election.
To my mind, Gerry, it starts with that no from March the 8th. And the next step now is to provide the electorate in all parts of the country, in all constituencies, with an equivalent of that no. That there is one or two people in each constituency who stands for that no, and will draw it to themselves, because they're articulating the value expounded in by the no side in that, which are essentially values of the retention of our understanding of ourselves. That no more of this doing things at the bidding of outsiders. Family needs to be buttressed, having had come under multiple attacks in the last 12 or so years. Irish nationhood needs to be respected, and we need to stop this. We need to stop what's going on. We need to turn back. We need to shut the borders. And we need to start thinking, what are we going to do with all these people who don't know where they are and don't care? And why are they here? Most of them, I don't know. I mean, we have to be able to say this. And McDowell has been in the past very courageous on that, I have to say, and I mean, I disagree with him way back in the very beginning, this is the ironic part of it, that I was the guy doing that kind of trendy thing against him when he was proposing that Anchor Baby amendment there. And I mean, he overwhelmingly won that as well. So he's a formidable force in political terms.
But John, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but just, even back then, when big issues like this were being discussed, we had public platforms that afforded opportunity to deeply thoughtful people on both sides. So, like, in the terms of McDowell on one side, an intellectual senior counsel, and yourself on the other, and people had the opportunity to listen to kind of philosophical thinking on huge issues,
Yeah, yeah,
and
and
that is gone in
gone,
today's.
gone, and that's a real problem that we can't underestimate, Jerry. Now, there's some compensation in that the alternative media, the guerrilla media, have shown in this campaign that they can be effective, that they're actually beginning to become highly effective. I don't know, the different channels, the different, like, people are seeing stuff now that they wouldn't have seen even 3 or 4 years ago. They on Telegram or on YouTube or BitChute, all these people are becoming literate in all of those areas. Even older people, and they know it's out there and they want to know about it. So, like, this is very important. But and you're right, like those conversations, because they weren't kind of conversations or racist, like they were actually about issues like, what should our constitution say? I mean, my point of disagreement with that amendment was nothing to do necessarily with the people coming in the sense, except that I frankly didn't understand how grave it was. Michael McDowell did understand. He was looking at the figures, he was looking at what was coming in, and he was saying, what the hell? And he went into it in a lot of detail. But my position was that I believe that if you're born on the soil of Ireland, that there's something precious about that idea, because you're only born in one place, and to not belong to that place, or not to have some claim to belong to that place, I think was wrong. However, that wasn't factoring in the fact that it was an abuse, that it was a scam, that it was scamming that was going on. But my argument about that was, well, if there's scamming going on, the government's there to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to change the constitution to stop the scammers.
No.
But anyway, that's long ago, and I freely admit, and I've said it multiple times, that Michael McDowell was right on that occasion, and I was wrong. But that's what this public discussion should be like. We're not allowed to have that, because if you disagree with these creeps, you're far right, and you're demonized, and you're part of the outgroup that is threatening our democracy and threatening our values and all this bullshit, when they have no values and no democracy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
and Varadkar, above all, was the epitome of somebody who has no democratic sensibility and no values, politically speaking. I don't know what his values are in his private life, and I don't care. But he showed no values in his political, until last week in Boston and Washington, when he started to sound like a human being. Now, it's very interesting that, you see, something very interesting happens, Jerry, when you see, when these guys step out. It happened with Charlie Flanagan before. And people forget, you see, people have very sharp memories about politics. But when Charlie Flanagan retired there last year, he gave an interview to the Irish Crimes, in which he talked about the terrible thing that woke had become, really, all their political correctness gone mad, all this sort of stuff, and oh yeah. Now, nobody seemed to remember at that moment that Charlie Flanagan was the architect of the hate speech laws back in 2019. And I was actually I did an interview with Grit about it at that time. And he was just as bad as any of them. But it seems that once the shadow of the Combine is lifted, they become
themselves again.
They become Democrats again, And they're applying, as I said, that Charlie was applying to rejoin the human race. And in a certain sense, that's what Varadkar was doing in America this time. He was replying to rejoin the human race by speaking up for the Palestinians. Well, it's a start. But now, would you mind speaking up for your own people against yourself and the crimes you've committed against your own people? It's not just Bibi that commits crimes against his people or any other people's. Our own government has been committing crimes against the Irish people for years, certainly for the last 4 years. And we need atonement for that. And we need some form of reparation for that. And we need it to stop now.
Oh, well said. There's an element which, and I want to ask you on before we go, because we're running up on the hour soon. But there's an element that, at least back in Charlie's day and Gareth Fitzgerald's day, the office of Taoiseach was the highest. That was the top of the pyramid. Where you get a definite sense with some of Varadkar, even Martin Donnelly, is that their positions at senior levels of Irish government are a stepping stone to some global position.
100%. And I feel this very strongly. The first time we saw this syndrome was with Mary Robinson when she was president, and then she effed off a couple of months before the end of her term and got a job at the UN and so on. And and she seemed to have no concept of the affront that was to the Irish people and to their nation and to their government. But this is something that you see in these guys, that each one is different, but it bespeaks something that is very ominous, which is that the kind of people that we're attracting into politics or have been through the party systems, through certainly the Fine Gael Fianna Fáil Labour system parties, they're people who don't really have any particular affinity for Ireland. They have no love of Ireland. In fact, they're quite hostile to Ireland, as Desmond Fennell was saying there in that clip. That they're not interested in the Irish dream. They're not interested in the realization of the reunification of the national territory in the proper sense, not in the sense that Varadkar used to talk about as a rainbow nation, which good luck with that with Ian Paisley Jr. Like
there again, John, is an example, and this is literally only happened 2 days ago. Is he comes out and gives an off the cuff comment like that, the Irish flag and the Irish national anthem is up for grabs.
Yeah.
And it's like
he has a mandate.
It's like, what are you talking about? Do you know, like it's
it's also very dangerous, Gerry. I mean, anybody who's lived in this country as long as I have, or even half the length, must know that you're playing with fire if you start going down those roads. That's like that. Like 30 years ago, Peter would have been screaming at him to shut the hell up about that stuff. But now it's like, oh yeah, it's all over. No, it's not. They're still out there, and they're not. It's over their dead bodies or somebody else's that this is going to happen. And I would not recommend to. And the irony of it is, Gerry, that, and I've been saying this increasingly now in the last few years, as somebody who comes from a Irish nationalist background in the west of Ireland, and that was intensely, during the Troubles, particularly the early stages before the IRA really lost the run of itself. That was very strong sentiment in the West. And I was kind of quite astonished to come to Dublin and find that actually it wasn't there at all. But I look back now at that period and think, well, like there was no, the reunification of Ireland was always going to be an aspiration. But everybody, all the political systems, all the political parties agreed to take out the Articles 2 and 3, which were the pledge for the unification of Ireland. That's all it was, an aspiration. And yet they took it out. And now they're talking about, having, as it were, like waited for a certain number of years, that they think that the loyalist unionist people are going to kind of just succumb to all this. It's not going to happen. It's a dangerous thing to talk about, very dangerous. And they're not living there to be talking about it, And I really do think that the political establishment has lost the run of itself. And one of the factors is that it's bringing in people who just don't know anything about history, about Irish history, and care less. They don't know. Like a friend of mine was telling me there a few years ago when Daniel O'Connell's house opened up to the public and for after it was being done up, and this friend of mine went down there to see it and to get a tour around it, and the women at the counter were telling him, oh yeah, Varadkar's just been here, you missed him. And he said, oh really? Yeah. And he said, what did he say? Not much. Got his photograph taken and skedaddled. No interest.
Well, that was one of the they were that generation of politicians: Varadkar, Harris, Coveney, McEntee. They were already probably a step more addicted to the tech or involved in the tech world than maybe someone of my generation was. COVID came along and they found, we can run government from Twitter. or Instagram or TikTok,
Yes.
and that, you know, to Leo Varadkar getting his photo taken with those people is actually part of it, like in his head, is
Yeah, it's
for
just something to
that's
put up
part
on
of
your Twitter.
yeah,
It's
that's
some,
it's part of his job, or you know,
yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, that's something
disillusion.
that happened in journalism as well. You know, where something simple, analogous to that happened in journalism back about 15 years ago, where journalists, like when I went to the Irish Times, like there were very strict protocols as to how you behaved if you were working for the Irish Times and representing them, as I was as a columnist. So that when I went out there to do talks or whatever, I had to be kind of respectful towards people, and I wasn't supposed to be slagging off. Like they hated people writing columns in the Irish Times against another columnist, even though sometimes it was quite legitimate to disagree and politely, say I don't agree with Kevin Myers or Fenton O'Toole or whatever. But the editors never liked it, and yet when Twitter came along, it was free for all.
Mm.
You could go on and say what you like about anybody. Whether it was like the Archbishop of Dublin or your colleague in the next desk or anything, and nobody seemed to care. And this was like, it was like a total breakdown. And you see, those guys really, this is a syndrome that is kind of international, it's global, really, of this kind of particular kind of airhead that you get in politics now, who has no particular vision of politics, no affection for Ireland or whatever country, no knowledge, no reason to be there other than it's a career path. And by getting on that ladder, you can get into Europe and get a job with the commission or whatever it might be. And these guys are all kind of zombies insofar as like they don't care about anything. If you try to start a conversation with them about some philosophical or historical aspect of the Irish politics, they'd be looking at you as if you were crazy. Like, why are you telling me this stuff? Like, I don't care. That's the attitude. That's the way Varadkar was. It's the way that.
Well, it's the way McEntee was with,
Oh,
like
yeah,
with McDowell in that, that pivotal kind of interaction where
yeah,
it became very clear that one, it was like a lecturer and like somebody in high infants
yeah.
having a debate.
Oh, it's just, I mean, and poor McDowell. I mean, like he would be quite a gentleman, like he was like, and like, what do you do? I mean, you need someone to fight you back and be in some way capable of having an argument before you can sort of really get stuck in. It's terrible, really. But this is all World Economic Forum stuff. There's a certain kind of zombie that seems to crop up now in this culture, which is dominated by the World Economic Forum, and this started off. First of all, if you look back at the politics of our, of my youth, there was like some, what you might call sharks and go boys and all that. But there was quite a few of very significant people who were capable of articulating. Now, I'm talking about Sean McBride and Noel Brown and people, Peter Barry, for example, like just in the parties, like with Jim Kemmy, all these guys, and there were significant people, like, they read books, like they were interested in things. And then you see what happened was once the power was lifted off, like, basically, as I say, power was replaced by, contingent office. In other words, you could hold the office, you could have the car, provided you just did what you were told. If you didn't, they would find a way of getting rid of you. They get some dirt on you, they start something, whatever. And that's what happened. And then what happened the next phase then was that people out there in the countryside, in the cities, in the towns, and the solid, decent, respectable, thoughtful people of Ireland, and they do exist in huge numbers still, they just looked askance at politics. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a messenger boy for the EU. I want to, if I'm going to be involved in the politics of my country, I want to have the people's power to implement things on their behalf. So what happened? Those people stopped going in, and so you got all these zombies using as a ladder to get up the ladder and to get into another career, and that's one of the things that's happened, like that we really haven't understood that politics now is nothing like it was way back. I mean, obviously there were gobshites in all the parties, but I think the upper crust was pretty impressive in a lot of the times. Like Fine Gael, like Gareth Fitzgerald. disagree with him all you like, but he was a significant intellect
Yeah.
and a very kind of, warm individual and thoughtful. And he'd actually stop and talk to you about anything. I mean, just anything forever. He would get them to shut up was the problem, so like they were good men, really. Like, I mean, like I know we in the past we would slag them off, and that's all part of the cut and thrust of politics. But they were good men and able men, and they're not there anymore. Apart from McDowell, I have to say he's like a relic of the old age, and it's remarkable that I'm saying that now after all these years.
No, it is true, and I suppose we could stay on that track for a while, but I wanted to ask you a last final question, John, and I suppose it's this. I think we both feel that the political structures or the establishment are it's starting to crumble. And this can be either a time of great opportunity or one of also possible danger if it does, if there's kind of a sudden collapse of, some of the main political parties. How do you see the future, the immediate future, we'll say, to the end of the year, and do you see a trigger Varadkar's resignation triggering an early election?
Well, the first worry I would have is that the Combine, the secret unknowns, the predators, are watching this, and maybe with some dismay that their little system here is beginning to disintegrate, because this was their petri dish, and they don't want to lose Ireland as that kind of laboratory of all their little plans. And so that would worry me, that there might be something up their sleeve that they would try to bring back the conditions or something like them that existed back in the middle of 2020, say. That would frighten me. That would alarm me really quite dramatically. But let's imagine that doesn't happen and we move on to the next election. And I think that the next general election, we have the European elections and we have the local elections in June. I suspect the general election will be in around September, because I don't think they can allow it to go into next year, because then they don't have any wiggle room at all. And so then that means that we have to then see how do we actually, there is that danger, that if you have the main political parties is collapsing and there's nothing coherent, there's no cohering of what's the remnants that are there, then you're into a potentially chaotic situation. But, in some respects, I think that's preferable to what we have. So I'm not that concerned about it. The main thing I think is that we need to find that kind of, you see, what happened the last time is really instructive. And I've talked about this many times about what happened in 2011. That there was that moment then in late November 2010, where the Troika had come in and essentially had abjectly humiliated the Irish people and their government, and accepted the surrender of Ireland's economic sovereignty, and then went away, leaving the people absolutely kind of distraught and bereft and angry and absolutely livid. I've never seen anything like it, to the point where everybody almost in the country was looking to start a political movement and saying we're going to take those guys out for good and all, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but particularly Fianna Fáil and the Greens at that time. But then suddenly a movement did appear. And, it's kind of, I find when I start talking about this in public, nobody knows what I'm talking about, because they don't remember. Again, it's that thing. They don't remember. A movement started. Democracy Now. Who were the principals? Fenton O'Toole, David McWilliams, and somewhat belatedly on the back of the truck, Eamon Dunphy. Right? And they announced they were going to do it. They were going to lead the revolution. They were going to march on government buildings, and they were going to get their troops in there, and they were going to make sure that this never happened again. What happened then? Well, the election was called in January of 2011, and immediately Fenton O'Toole came out, wrote a really moving column in the Irish Times, in which he said that, sorry, the notice is too short. We can't get our act together in time. And I wrote about it afterwards that, the revolution has been postponed because we couldn't find a babysitter. And what actually happened? It's what actually happened. I'm not saying 100% that
But
this
that
was.
breaks the heart of the ground troops. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, it does. Well, you see, the point is here,
And
Jerry,
is that
that,
the
that
point?
all of those people who were thinking of starting their own movements looked to it and they saw Fintan O'Toole, who's a considerable figure. Even if you disagree with him, you think he's a substantial person and he's doing it. Well, I'll vote for him, even though I don't agree with a single word he says. I'm going to vote for him over those bastards, right? For sure. I was going to do that. I was going to vote for Fintan O'Toole's party, right?
But
That's how bad things were. That's how
but
bad things were. I can't make it more graphic than that. Now,
well,
but then
that nearly tells you how bad things have got for RTE. The fact that what was the RT presenter that topped the poll in Dublin's House? The economic advisor,
Lee, Lee.
Lee.
Yeah, George Lee. Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. Well, but then you see, what really happened was, whether it was deliberate or not, and I'm kind of not saying whether it was deliberate or not. But what kind of, that Bob Dylan song, the times are changing, and they say, "Hey, Mr. Congressman, please hear my call. Don't stand in the doorway. Don't block up the hall." Really good advice. Well, that's what they did. Amo Tesco and Clinton 19 and Mac Williams. They stood in the doorway and blocked up the hall. And then at the very last moment, Inde came sweeping along from his Mercedes, and they stepped aside. And Dame Inde stepped right in and stepped right up and sold Ireland down the river.
Right, John. I think we'll leave it at that. We're running at about an hour and 10 minutes. Thanks a million. It's been very enjoyable having a chat with you.
Thanks,
and again, now before you go, anyone that's still watching us, please support John's Substack, johnwaters.substack.com. You can there's a link in the description and the comments to buy a coffee, and the proceeds will be split between me and John, any that are in it. And thanks for watching, and I suppose thanks, John, for coming on.
Thank you, Jerry. Pleasure.